Hi, my name is Dr. Ellie Worthington and I work for the Hammersmith and Fulham GP Federation Training Hub. And this is part of our Returning to Work in General Practice webinar series. This is the third episode, which is a new normal adapting to change in general practice. So why are we thinking about this? In the other two webinars, we already considered what COVID, the clinical disease, is as a new entity for us to have to manage as GPs, as well as the wider health and social care system. And we also thought about the way that the pandemic has affected the way that we work in our second week in terms of remote working and all of the new technologies that we've needed to embrace. And so this third week is really understanding that all of this change and uncertainty has an impact on us psychologically, and that it has been an incredibly stressful time for many of us, both in our personal and work lives. So change challenges all of us. As much as it can energize us, it can also drain us. Different people adapt differently to remote working. Some people enjoy the efficiency of it, and others are really missing face-to-face consultations. Different people have different levels of risk aversion and are therefore can end up going home still carrying their concerns about whether or not they've done the right thing or the safe thing for patients if they've been managed remotely. And as I said, COVID is a cause of stress for our patients, as well as for us as a workforce and all of the pressures that we've been under. So we just wanted to spend some time this morning looking at stress management and how do we as individuals, as teams, as cultures in healthcare better manage our stress. And I think that it's worryingly, stress is very common, although perhaps reassuringly, this you're not alone if you've experienced it. But unfortunately, it is getting commoner. And I would also add that there are often unspoken cultural pressures and expectations that can also add stress to our lives. And I think this is particularly relevant for any of our supported return to training trainees who might be juggling their new motherhood with their identity as GP and the thought of going back to work, and this cultural pressure to have to be both full-time mum and full-time doctor somehow at the same time. The Mental Health Foundation study that was done in 2018, so pre-COVID, and was the largest known study of stress levels in the UK, showed that 74% of people at that point had felt so stressed in the past 12 months that they had been overwhelmed or unable to cope. And so if you have felt stressed, you are in the majority of us. 47%, so nearly half, reported eating unhealthily due to stress, and nearly a third had increased their alcohol. And so stress is it's common, as I said, and can have a big impact on our own behaviour, on our health behaviours, as well as on our general sense of well-being, and ultimately on our ability to enjoy life and also to work and find satisfaction in our work. And so that's why we felt it was an important topic to look at today. The three aims of this webinar are for us to recognise, acknowledge and normalise anxiety as part of our kind of human reaction to lots of the things that are going on around us. Secondly, to understand ourselves and our stressors, hopefully by demystifying and deconstructing some of the process that happens underneath your felt experiential stress, having a think about what's actually going on there. And then lastly, to empower ourselves to try and manage our stress levels better, because there are loads of things that we can do as individuals, as well as, like I said, within our healthcare culture, to enable us to become more resilient and build up our strength and stress resilience reservoir. So for doctors, this will be a familiar kind of textbook picture of our nervous system, which is crudely split into parasympathetic and sympathetic, and you'll be familiar with the adrenaline-driven state of arousal that's known commonly as fight or flight, that causes your pupils to dilate and your heart rate to increase and your blood pressure to go up, etc., to provide that vital energy to the vital organs and to cause the blood to flow away from your peripheries, as opposed to the rest and digest state of a calm that is the parasympathetic or thrive state, that will cause the opposite physiological effect, and the blood flow will increase to your peripheries and your heart rate will slow down and your blood vessels will relax. And cortisol is another hormone that's important in the fight or flight state, and this is controlled by the HPA axis. And I think it's important to remember the physical basis for stress, that it's a primitive and inbuilt response that we have as human beings, designed to help us survive. A stress response is really, an acute stress response is really important for us whenever we're faced with any kind of danger or threats, but what we are not designed for is to live with a constant state of perceived threat or danger, which is unfortunately what seems to have happened in our modern society, where we no longer have lions to fight off. We just have often psychosocial relationships that stress us out, and lots of interactions with others that cause us to live in a more perpetual state or chronic stress, which is really harmful for our bodies, as we will go on to mention. So if we think about the stress response, any stress starts with a stimulus, and critically our perception of that stimulus, which determines it to be some kind of threat to our safety, to our existence, to our status quo. And between the stimulus and the response, which is what our behavior ends up being, there is this process that goes on very quickly inside our brain pathways, but it's essentially our judgment on our capability as individuals to meet the demand of this stimulus or threat. Our autonomic nervous system is involuntarily activated the minute we perceive there to be threats, and this can generate feelings of anxiety, heart palpitations, sweaty palms, etc., all because we are physiologically responding to the sensation of threat. And important to note that our bodies are poor discriminators between physical and emotional stresses, and we can typically have what are called micro stressors that go on throughout our day, which could include our alarm going off in the morning, notifications on our phone, the sign of an aggressive email from a colleague who perhaps you're in conflict with. It could be your grocery delivery not arriving on time. It could be spilling your coffee on your shirt just as you're about to walk out of the door. Any of those things cause a low but small level of stress that continues to activate our autonomic system throughout our day. And if you have enough of those, it means that your body never gets to go into recovery mode, and so it perpetuates this state of chronic stress. And as I said, you're more likely to be stressed by emotional than physical threats in our modern world, and most of these come from interactions with others. And so one thing that it might be interesting to reflect on is the nature of our relationships and whether they are helping or hindering our levels of stress. And it's a natural response to fear and to threat, to want to defend ourselves. And so commonly we do end up behaving in ways that are basically trying to preserve our sense of safety and return us back to our status quo. So another way of thinking about stress is in the following pictorial representation. And so again, you have your situation or event, and the first thing that you do is you make an assessment of that situation. And that within that assessment, you're asking yourself, is there a threat, which would be the red box, or is there not a threat? And some people will find different things threatening. For example, one person being stuck in traffic on their will find it a very stressful situation. Perhaps they're worried they're going to be late for work, and they then find that very stressful to sit there. Another person might have left a lot of extra time, or not have a time demand on when they need to get somewhere, and so sitting in exactly the same traffic doesn't have an impact on them. They don't feel threatened by it. And so, as you can see, if you don't find a threat, then you won't have a stress response. And so this is just to highlight that our perception or our judgment of the event or situation is critical in terms of how we end up responding. And this will be one of the things that we look at trying to modify or change in order to minimize our stress responses. However, obviously there are lots of things that do represent threats to us, many of which are outside of our control. And so if we do determine a threat, if you detect a threat somewhere, you make a second assessment. And again, all this is often very subconscious. You're not aware necessarily that it's happening. And you basically decide within yourself whether you can cope or not with this threat. If you feel that there's something that's come towards you, that you have got what it takes, then this is going to energize you and give you the positive stress that helps you to meet demands, to achieve, to succeed, to get things done. Maybe it's something that you've done before, or particularly maybe if you've had a really good night's sleep, you've eaten, you're not running late, so you're actually feeling fairly resilient. And so yes, there's an unexpected patient who's come or who's very complex, but actually you've got something to give them that day. Whereas perhaps the days where you haven't had a good night's sleep, or you might not have had time for your lunch yet, or you really need the loo and you haven't attended to some of those basic human needs, or perhaps you've had an upsetting kind of conversation with someone earlier in that day and you're still carrying that, those can all contribute to the sense of, I just can't deal with this thing today or right now. And that will then cause the negative stress response, which is, I think, what we'll all be familiar with as the kind of unpleasant sensation of feeling really stressed and overwhelmed. So that's the kind of process that's happening to us. And if you just keep this in your minds, because it's one of the things that we want to try and look at this pathway to either adjusting that sense of being able to cope, or affecting your initial assessment of the threat itself, because there are ways that we can monitor and adjust different parts of this process. I find this quote from Viktor Frankl, who's an Auschwitz Holocaust survivor. He was an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, philosopher and author, who wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth in our freedom. And here he's highlighting that not, obviously in his context, not everyone who went into Auschwitz died. There were some survivors, and he felt that it was quite a lot to do with an ability within a human to choose your response to adversity. And I find this deeply inspiring and encouraging, that we do have more power often than we think. And just to think back to the chart that we just looked at, we have opportunities to reframe our thinking and to reconsider what is a threat, and maybe change our perception so that it's no longer a threat. Sometimes getting in extra information about something can help you see it as less threatening, or understanding someone's intentions can reduce the sense of threat or attack. And there are also ways that we can release ourselves from being responsible for the threat and that sense of having to cope with it or not, just through accepting what's happening, and letting go of control. And all of these things, our aim is to stimulate our peripheral nervous system, our state of calm, our state of thrive, and get that part of our physiology working again and taking control, so that we end up feeling better. I'm going to share now from my own story of stress as a frontline GP. And this is from a few months ago. I call it my day of trouble, and it was a day much like any others, but I think I was probably overtired as a context, and probably tired of COVID, tired of lockdown, tired of pandemic life. I think I was running late that day. I had a lot of interruptions. I was on duty. I was really feeling the pressure for some reason, and I felt every kind of demand and interruption as something that was piling up, and more and more feeling unable to manage. I also had some anxious colleagues who were asking me to do things, and I think I was getting some of their anxiety by transference. And all of this culminated in me feeling essentially very threatened. And just to say, I had to go back and figure this out afterwards. I wasn't aware of all this happening in the moment. All I knew is that I went from the yellow box up there to suddenly feeling triggered, and going into what I've put as behaviours on the right. So feeling emotionally very overwhelmed, very panicky, anxious, and feeling like I needed to take control of everything. But as I went back home and tried to reflect on how I'd ended up coming to that place, I realised that some of my underlying beliefs and perceptions had been really critical in leading me to end up there. And so one of the things I'd been feeling was I had perceived threat, and I had concluded that I couldn't cope. I felt like it was all too much for me. I started doubting myself. I didn't think I could do this anymore, and I felt like my time was being robbed because I think there were patients who were, in my experience, talking too much, and I were going over their 10 minutes, and I felt very powerless, and I felt kind of a victim of the system that I was in. And all this led to a big stress response inside me. I know that physiologically I entered a state of arousal very quickly, and that led to my kind of emotional response of feeling very impatient, irritable with patients, with my colleagues, feeling like I needed to defend myself, and feeling alone, like I was having to do all of this by myself and that no one was helping me. So you may relate to some of these feelings, to some of these stories, and there's other days where I might have the same kind of circumstances in the yellow circle up there, and it not necessarily lead me to this place. And that I hope, I like to think, is the majority of my working life. But there have been these moments where it has all felt like it's got on top of me, and that's partly why I feel like this is a really important topic for us to look at, because I found that there were lots of positive things that I could incorporate that have really helped me not to go back to this place. So when we did this as a live webinar, and we got some audience anonymized here responses, just for you to have a think yourself about your own stress patterns. And I'm just going to share with you what some of our audience said, because hopefully this will again give you a sense of not being alone in what we go through. So the first question I asked people was, how do you recognize when you are stressed? What do you notice in your body or your mind? And you might want to just have a think about that for yourself. Part of our awareness of our stress response is learning to recognize when we've been triggered, and whether that is more of a physical or more of an emotional response that you feel. So there's, as you can see, a variety of experiences, lots of physical symptoms that you would relate directly to the autonomic nervous system being activated, the racing heart, the sweating, it affecting sleep, so that sense of a busy mind, and then the way it affects your behavior, so lacking empathy, not being able to listen, feeling impatient, irritable, hard to think straight, unable to focus. And all of these, I hope you can see, to have compassion on yourselves, because you're feeling unsafe, and that you just need to try and protect yourself. This is what happens to us, and we're trying to fight, flight, or freeze in our moments. Then the second question I asked was, what are your stress triggers? And again, I think it's really helpful to, as individuals, to identify these, because they will be different for each of us. For many of us, running late is a really big issue. And then for others who perhaps less time conscious, it feels less stressful. And so knowing what your own particular areas of vulnerability are can help you to try and build in strength around those areas, and obviously avoid them as much as you can, but also know that if you are in a position where there are unavoidable stress triggers going to be happening, making sure that you've built in other things to your day, if at all possible, in terms of self-care. So here we had people talking about interruptions, running late, not being able to meet deadlines, feeling out of control, the need to pick up, so other responsibilities, particularly with children, feeling like you need to leave work on time, can be incredibly stressful. Complex patients who demand more from us emotionally or mentally, people feeling like you're picking up other people's work and they may not have, perhaps not feeling supported, feeling like people are not understanding where you're at. Again, the physical demands, physical needs that we all have of food and drink and sleep and human interaction, those are all important parts of helping us avoid stress. So again, hopefully you can relate to some of those, and if not, find your own. And then the final question that we asked was, what do you find useful as a stress release? And so obviously you may already know the things that you find the most helpful, whether that's addressing your physical needs through exercise, or whether it's relaxation, both in terms of physical practices like yoga or mindfulness or prayer, and perhaps it's that need for human connection, talking to someone, sharing, having a hug, speaking to a friend, being able to connect to those that we love and who provide us with care and support. There are people mentioning going for walks in nature, listening to music, and then again this idea of accepting something and being able to let go of the things that are outside of our control, which we'll come on to look at in a bit more detail. So again, I would encourage you to think about what your most useful stress releases are, and whether there are new things that you might be able to incorporate into your life. So in terms of what did I do to help myself, I think I had two goals really. One was how can I do something different in the moment if this happens again? And secondly, is there anything I can do to prevent myself ending up here in this kind of more extreme place of feeling really overwhelmed? And I think that they're both really important questions, and they're both things that we need to continue to learn how to do. And it's likely that we will continue to remain under significant pressure. But the good news is the pressure doesn't need to destroy us. And that's what I'm hopefully trying to communicate to us all today. So the things that I found helpful were breathing. So a really simple breathing exercise of counting in for 5 seconds, holding my breath for 2 seconds, and then breathing out for 5, because we know again that this is activating your peripheral nervous system, and just like breathing slowly and deeply in and out of the lungs, it can trick your body into thinking that you don't need to panic. I also found that where I was giving my attention or focus to was really powerful in terms of whether it led me into kind of negative emotions. And if I was able to put my attention away from the stress and the pressure and the sense of kind of interruptions or injustices of what I was being asked to do, and just focus on even the thought that I can do this, I found that a very powerful way of reducing my anxiety. Reframing is this idea that the threat doesn't need to be a threat. So for me, knowing that I've got what it takes, as well as speaking this out loud, because we know that our brains respond to what we hear more than what we think. So it's really important to speak out kind of positive affirmations over ourselves can actually have a real impact on our sense of self-belief and confidence. And then finally, the acceptance. I decided after this event, I was going to let go of control over my surgery schedule and stop trying to micromanage every appointment and make sure it was completely correct. And I've just found that that's just taken a whole load of pressure off myself. And I've been much freer to just go with the flow and just trust that there's going to be grace for me to get through my day. Quick thought on control, because sometimes it's helpful just to, I suppose, identify this, but there's very little that is actually within our control, even though as humans, we like to think that we're in control of our lives. And there are actually a lot of things outside of that. I think maybe a more helpful word is influence, because there are things you can influence that are beyond your own self. But if you start in the middle there, I think that's one of the key messages, is the one thing you can control is yourself. You can have self-control over your responses, over your thought life, over your emotions, actually, if you're able to make some of these adaptations. And I think that's helping you get to an empowered place of not feeling like you're a victim of circumstance. Obviously, if we go to the outer circle, the global pandemic is not something within any of our control. And so there's no point in spending energy trying to control it. And again, just accepting the kind of environment that we find ourselves in can be really helpful. And then I think in terms of your immediate environment, there are things you can do to change that. If it's too hot, you can open a window. If it's too cold, you can put on a heater or a jumper. If it's dark, you could open the curtains. Like, there are things you can do to adjust that. Your workload, some of that you might be able to influence through conversation, through changing systems, for example. And then some of it will just be, unfortunately, there, and you're not able to change that. And again, it's a waste of energy to spend time resenting your work if you just need to get on and do it. And then the behavior of others, again, you can't control other people, but you can influence them. And again, the more kind of centered and grounded you are able to be, and the more reasonable in your approach and communication. And again, if we're in our parasympathetic phase, we're much more able to think clearly, to think compassionately, to think thoughtfully, and respond to things in thoughtful ways. And that can actually have a big impact on others. If you are if you're relaxed in yourself, it's more likely to relax those around you, including your patients, and make them feel cared for. I find the serenity prayer really helpful. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And again, just that idea of being able to let go of what is outside of your influence. In terms of trying to deliberately activate our peripheral nervous system, as I mentioned, these are just kind of hacks, I guess, but these might be practices you want to introduce into your life to try and improve your overall resilience, to reduce your likelihood of becoming stressed in the first place, as well as being kind of immediate things that you might be able to do in the moment. Obviously, some of these are more user-friendly than others, depending on where you are. But breathing, like I said, one of the breathing exercises I like to do, if there are children or young people, is using your hand to get you to breathe in as you trace round your finger and out. And you do this for a second breath, breathing in and out, and a third breath, and so on until you've done 5 breaths. And again, that can just help to bring you into a state of calm. Obviously, that's linked very much with meditation practice, with mindfulness, where you're paying attention to your breathing, putting your focus onto something very neutral, which is the air flowing in and out of your lungs, and it can help you let go of lots of negative emotion. Laughing is scientifically proven to release stress, to reduce levels of anxiety and depression. So it's a no-brainer. Find funny people or find things that make you laugh, and actively, pursue watching those or interacting with them. Exercise is, I can't rate highly enough in terms of anti-anxiolytic effects, as well as being so good for us, our well-being, our physical well-being, and our mental well-being. And so I would say, if you're wherever you are with exercise, just try and incorporate a bit more, and walking is a brilliant place to start. If you can even fit in a 10-minute walk between your surgeries, it can really help to reduce stress levels. Meditation, I've mentioned, there are obviously different ways of doing that, and connecting to your spirituality. Nature and green space, because there are actually shapes in nature, fractals, that again have an anti-stress effect on us. So it's just amazing what's kind of can be on your doorstep, unless you're in a very, very urban built up area, in which case just try and find any bit of green space that you can. Social contact, humans are social creatures. We're not designed to live alone, and so having meaningful connection again builds our resilience and means that we're less likely to get stressed, as well as obviously it being an outlet for when we do find ourselves stressed. Touch is a huge one as well, in terms of so safe physical touch, being a way of our bodies have inbuilt sensory fibers, where if they're touched, particularly on our shoulders and back, it reduces our stress levels. So someone giving us a hug or a back massage, again, can really reduce our stress levels. And then yoga, which we've touched on, that has, again, physical and mental health benefits. Mitigating factors, so you're less likely to get stressed if you have a good support network, if you tend to be someone who has a sense of control in your life, as opposed to just living as a victim. And that's in contrast to trying to control life, but it's a sense of it's coming from a place where you feel empowered to make change, you have autonomy over your decisions. That is a mitigating factor against stress. Your attitude and your outlook, so if you're optimistic, hopeful, that often tends to reduce your stress levels. Your ability to deal with emotions, how you emotionally regulate, and again, this is something that can be learned and practiced and improved on. And then your knowledge and preparation for situations. So if you know it's going to be a long day, you're on call, you're not going to get much of a break, what little things could you do to try and mitigate against that day completely hammering you? And the breakout rooms is what we did when we did the live webinar. So I'm going to finish this session now and just say thank you very much for your time, and I wish you well in your return to work. Thanks for listening.